I put out a video a few weeks ago demonstrating the Infernal Blow Slayer with which I both started Arch Nemesis League and played to 38 challenges and level 100. All I showed was the character clearing one map and killing Veritania, but this video will go into more detail about the item and skill choices. Sentinel League will be starting in a matter of hours, so I wanted to get this video out before I started playing again. The alternate ailments Brittle, Sap, and Scorch are the focal points of this build. These function similarly to Chill and Shock, applying debuffs to enemies based on the damage taken by the hit that applied them. Brittle gives you additional crit chance, Sap lowers enemy damage, and Scorch lowers enemy elemental resistances. Because the effects of these ailments are based on how much damage is taken by the target, a lot of this character is built around dealing as much damage per hit as it can. Infernal Blow is a great choice for this because its charged explosion deals 396% of base damage. Aside from that, a combination of crit multiplier, triple damage procs, ruthless blows, and other multiplicative hit damage scaling ensures that bosses take some chunky hits and are therefore inflicted with powerful ailments. If you aren't familiar with Brittle, Sap, and Scorch, you should be because they're overpowered. The first thing to know is that you aren't by default able to inflict these ailments. There's a limited number of ways to gain access to them. The most common way currently is through the Secrets of Suffering Keystone passive, which is available either through the Interrogation unique Cluster Jewel or through the Alternating Scepter heist base. There are other ways to inflict these ailments, and for this build I've chosen to use the Leadership's Price amulet. This amulet prevents you from applying the default elemental ailments, which are Chill, Freeze, Shock, and Ignite. In exchange, under the right condition, Leadership's Price grants Brittle Conflux, Sapping Conflux, and Scorching Conflux. Brittle Conflux causes all damage to always inflict Brittle. Sapping Conflux does the same for Sap, and Scorching Conflux does the same for Scorch. Let me briefly explain why these confluxes are functionally better than Secrets of Suffering. Secrets of Suffering causes your cold damage to inflict Brittle instead of Chill and Freeze, your lightning damage to inflict Sap instead of Shock, and your fire damage to inflict Scorch instead of Ignite. Builds that want to fully utilize Secrets of Suffering need to scale all three elemental damage types to scale all three ailments. Leadership's Price, on the other hand, causes all damage, including non-elemental damage, to contribute to all three ailments. In other words, the effect of Brittle is based on the sum of your physical, cold, lightning, fire, and chaos damage, instead of just cold damage. The same logic applies for the effects of Sap and Scorch. For this build, that means I can focus on a singular damage type and still scale all three ailments. Another advantage for Conflux is that Secrets of Suffering only applies these ailments on critical strikes. On the other hand, with Brittle Conflux, every hit will inflict Brittle, even a non-crit. That advantage doesn't really matter much for this build since it's a crit build anyway, but it does make it easier to get the first crit off if the first hit doesn't crit. The downsides of Leadership Price are that it uses up your amulet slot and that it requires some finesse to activate. In particular, it only works when your two highest attributes are equal. Let's summarize the build's performance. If I'm doing the math right, my DPS is 6 million if you factor in the charged explosions and the Slayer's 20% culling. There's a lot of room for improvement here, but I wanted to focus on defenses, especially as I pushed for level 100. Clearing maps is satisfying, with explosions that can chain well off screen thanks to Anomalous Infernal Blow and Divergent Melee Splash. I'm also very happy with the defensive layers. I have 6500 life, which is pretty low for a level 100 character in my opinion, but there's a lot more to being tanky than having a lot of HP. Yesterday's video is a great example of that, with that character having 16,000 HP, but still feeling squishier than this one. Defensive layers for this build include 30,000 evasion, 100% spell suppression, 48% physical damage taken as elemental, 10% reduced damage taken, 21 fortification, 30% crit reduction, 55% curse reduction, and 34% chaos resistance. Flasks provide an additional 4,000 evasion, 15% physical damage taken as elemental, 20% less elemental damage taken, and 49% curse reduction. I also apply Blind with 20% increased effect, which further improves my chance to evade, and Sap makes my enemies deal 20% less damage. I also have immunity to elemental ailments and corrupted blood. Let's break down the gear choices. I already talked about Leadership's Price, but I should mention that the amulet also has maximum resistance modifiers, each of which rolls between -3% and +3%. I never bothered to get a better rolled one, but that would have been a high priority upgrade had I chosen to invest more in this character. Also, the anointment on it is Frenetic, which gives me the extra maximum frenzy charge that I didn't want to path to on the tree. The only other unique I have equipped is Arn's Anguish. This turns my endurance charges into brutal charges, giving me a chance to deal triple damage instead of providing physical damage reduction. The triple damage is important for the big chunky hits I'm going for, and the lack of physical damage reduction is compensated for by physical damage taken as elemental modifiers. My weapon is an exquisite blade. I chose this base type because of its crit multi implicit, and because I wanted to fulfill my Maul Ninja fantasies. The affixes are physical damage, attack speed, more crit multi, and the hits can't be evaded prefix. I like the hits can't be evaded mod because it means I can neglect all accuracy investment and ignore any map mods that affect hit chance, such as reduced accuracy and monsters blind on hit. I would have preferred a weapon with 2 crit multi suffixes, but I never bothered to craft one. If you start with a fractured attack speed base, it's not too hard to craft a weapon just like this one, but with global crit multi instead of the multi-mod. My body armor is a rare Zodiac leather. I bought a base with a fractured life roll and hit it with Essences of Horror and Eldritch currency until I was satisfied with the mods. I needed spell suppression on every gear slot to avoid spending inefficient passive points on spell suppression. I also needed a high amount of physical damage taken as elemental to make up for the lack of armor and endurance charges, which is why I used Essences of Horror here. Also note the Frenzy Charge generation implicit. This is important for making sure I never drop Frenzy Charges. For my helmet, I bought a Lion Pelt with this Infernal Blow enchantment, then used a combination of Essence crafting and Eldritch currency to craft the implicit and explicit mods. Like the body armor, the helmet also has 15% physical damage taken as elemental. These gloves I'm pretty sure I just bought with all the mods on there, just life, spell suppression, and some resistance. All I needed to do was craft attack speed, then use Eldritch Embers and Ichors to hit the implicits. I'm pretty sure that double influenced gloves with 1 additional strike and +1 max frenzy charge would be better than these, but I didn't want to invest in crafting them or adjust the rest of my gear to accommodate them. For the boots, I bought a base with fractured chaos resistance. I then used veiled chaos orbs until I saw a decent tier of spell suppression and also unveiled strength and intelligence. The veiled mod was important for making sure my strength equaled my dexterity, and for satisfying intelligence requirements for gems. The build only has 62 intelligence, but that's more than enough. After hitting the suffixes, I used Eldritch currency to hit a good tier of life and then craft the implicits. I tried grinding labs for the 10% penetration if you haven't killed recently enchantment, but that one is hard to hit and I eventually gave up. My left ring is a coral ring with fractured tier 1 life. I'd have preferred a vermilion ring, but it wasn't worth the cost for me at the time. I used Essences of Hysteria to get the physical damage as extra fire damage mod until I saw a decent third prefix, which in this case was elemental damage with attack skills. I think I got lucky hitting high tier lightning resistance with the Essence, then got lucky again with the Ashling Unveil for hybrid chaos resistance. I finished the ring with curse reduction. My right ring is also a fractured coral ring, but this one is a delve base with fractured flammability on it. Once again, I used Essences of Hysteria for physical damage as extra fire damage. I'm pretty certain that high-tier elemental damage with attack skills is a better prefix than the Essence mod, but I crafted this before I switched from multi-strike to Awakened added fire damage. Awakened added fire damage makes the Hysteria mod a lot less efficient for the build. More on why multi-strike sucks later. My flasks are a life flask for instant recovery and bleeding removal, Taste of Hate, a ruby flask, and a topaz flask for damage mitigation, and a quicksilver flask because I couldn't figure out what else to do with the last slot. This build really doesn't need movement speed, so I probably should have swapped that out at some point. Now on to the passive tree, starting with the Ascendancy notables. Masterful Form sets my endurance charge cap equal to my frenzy charge cap. This, combined with Arn's Anguish, means I have 7 maximum brutal charges, which altogether grant 42% chance to deal triple damage. Brutal Fervor gives persistent leech and damage reduction, and makes leech instances last twice as long. Bane of Legends and Headsmen are basically just damage notables, the latter of which provides the Slayer's signature 20% culling. This is the rest of the tree. I won't explain every choice, but I'll go over the important bits. The keystones are Vol Pact for improved leech, and Call to Arms for an instant Enduring Cry. Let's go over some of the important clusters. This Fortify mastery is huge and makes it so that I don't need to use the Fortify support gem. Tribal Fury gets me to 2 additional strikes for Infernal Blow. I could have dropped it if I had 2 additional strikes on my gloves alone, but I wanted the cluster anyway for this mastery, which noticeably improves quality of life while clearing maps. Thanks to this Armor and Evasion mastery, this small passive on the bottom of the tree, and this small passive on the right side of the tree, each frenzy charge grants 17% increased evasion rating, for a total of 119% increased evasion from frenzy charges alone. This cluster, in addition to being really efficient for damage, also gives frenzy charge generation on kill, allowing frenzy charges to stack up more quickly than once every 15 seconds while mapping. Furthermore, it gives access to this charge mastery, which massively increases the duration of my frenzy and brutal charges. This does 2 things. First, it enables 100% frenzy charge uptime with the body armor implicit. Second, it allows Enduring Cry to reliably maintain brutal charges, because otherwise there's no way to increase the duration of brutal charges. Increasing endurance charge duration has no effect on brutal charge duration. Speaking of charge generation, I take this sword mastery over here because it allows me to quickly stack up frenzy charges in isolated boss encounters, such as Eldritch Invitations. If I had to wait for my body armor to generate the charges, I'd have to wait a minute and a half to hit 7. Lastly, I want to talk about this crit mastery over here, where I take 50% increased ailment effect instead of 25% crit multiplier. I was going to explain mathematically why this choice makes sense, but I don't want to digress too much. Long story short, simply getting more damage is an inefficient way to scale ailment effect. So if you're playing a build with alternate ailments, I recommend some light investment into ailment effect to make sure you can still get high ailment effect on tankier enemies. With this mastery, I can inflict 15% brittle with damage that would previously have only inflicted 10% brittle. To achieve the same effect by simply getting more damage, I would need to nearly triple my damage. Now let's get into the jewels. I use a Watcher's Eye with 2 Purity of Elements mods, each of which gives physical damage taken as elemental. My cluster jewel is a large cluster with Feed the Fury, Fuel the Fight, and Smite the Weak. This jewel with life and triple crit multi was actually pretty cheap given how few people were playing melee fire skills in the Arch Nemesis League. The other jewel also has life and damage mods, but also has immunity to corrupted blood. Last but not least, I have a Lethal Pride socketed here. Lethal Pride causes all small passives in its radius to grant additional strength, which helps me equalize my strength and dexterity for leadership's price. It also adds an extra modifier to each notable passive based on its seed number. I ended up settling for this one, which gives me 15% melee crit multi, 20% melee damage, 8% max life, and 5% physical damage taken as fire. These are all on notables that I'd already planned to allocate anyway. Now let's go over gems. I choose Anomalous Infernal Blow because it enables chaining explosions. Let me explain what I mean by that. When you hit a monster with Infernal Blow, it applies a debuff that causes that monster to explode on death. The explosion deals fire damage based on the dead monster's maximum life, but does not also apply the debuff, which means enemies that are only hit by the explosion don't also explode. Anomalous Infernal Blow changes this. It causes the explosion to have a 20% chance to apply the debuff, meaning that explosions can cause more explosions. I didn't think that this would be very impactful for clear speed until I tried it myself. Turns out it's very noticeable, especially for Blight encounters. I found Blight to be extraordinarily fun for this character. Support gems are Divergent Melee Splash, Awakened Added Fire Damage, Awakened Elemental Damage with Attacks, Awakened Melee Physical Damage, and Awakened Fire Penetration. For a handful of endgame bosses, I swap out Divergent Melee Splash for Ruthless. I want to elaborate further on a couple of these support gem choices. First, Divergent Melee Splash is preferable to Awakened Melee Splash, because it causes the AoE damage to be the same as the main target damage. Awakened Melee Splash, on the other hand, is hardly distinguishable from the default Melee Splash. Second, you may notice that Multi-Strike is not being used here. This is because Multi-Strike doesn't work well with Infernal Blow. Basically, Infernal Blow's single-target DPS comes partly from explosions from its charged debuff, separate from the debuff that causes the max life-based explosions I mentioned a minute ago. These charged explosions deal 396% of base damage and are responsible for roughly 28% of Infernal Blow's DPS. The debuff that causes these explosions is applied every attack, so the explosion occurs once every 6th attack. However, when Infernal Blow repeats, for example with Multi-Strike, the repeats don't inflict the charged debuff. For every 3 hits, Infernal Blow will only apply the charged debuff once. This doesn't break the build, but it makes Multi-Strike a worse value proposition than it may seem. I actually played the build with Multi-Strike all the way to level 100 because I didn't know about this anti-synergy. You can see that I was using it in the short video I put out a few weeks ago. If my math is correct, Multi-Strike is still a net DPS increase of 14%. Numerically, that's not competitive with other support gem choices, but some may find it worth it for the quality of life from having higher attack speed. I found my attack speed comfortable enough without Multi-Strike, so I swapped it out for Awakened Added Fire Damage. I should also note that Awakened Multi-Strike is roughly 27% more damage, which is actually very close to Awakened Added Fire Damage in terms of DPS, but it's also pretty expensive and I didn't care to invest that much into this build. My auras are Purity of Elements and Grace. Purity of Elements is good for resists, elemental ailment immunity, and access to Watcher's Eye mods. Grace just gives a ton of evasion and is massive for this build's survivability. I use Leap Slam and Flame Dash for mobility. Both can get over walls just fine, but Flame Dash can be used to dodge things instantly and also break grasping vines. I have Enduring Cry bound to left click for brutal charge generation. It's linked to Divergent Urgent Orders so that it always generates charges even when no enemies are nearby. My only Vol skill is Vol Ancestral Warchief. I also use Ancestral Protector linked to multiple totems so that I can benefit from both Ancestral totems at the same time. This is pretty standard for melee builds that care about attack speed. Finally, I have Steel Skin linked to cast when damage taken, and a self-cast Frostbomb to deal with enemies that have annoying life regeneration, especially from Consecrated Ground and from being witnessed by the Maven. Overall, I'd say the build was a success. Not that I was expecting it to flop, it's not like the build was super experimental or anything. I was able to hit level 100 with moderately juiced mapping, and my only doubt at level 99 was to going AFK on Burning Ground without any life regen because I had Vol Pact. The character was able to comfortably do all the content I tried with it, with the exception of late wave simulacra. I was able to complete wave 30, but Kosis on the last few waves took a painfully long time. The damage reduction from 100% delirium meant I was only able to inflict 8% to 10% brittle on Kosis, which drastically lowered my DPS. With some more investment into damage and non-damaging ailment effect, I'm sure I could have made it pretty smooth, but as the build is now, I probably wouldn't do a simulacrum run again. My only gripe with the playstyle is that I strongly dislike gem swapping, which comes with the territory when playing a build that uses melee splash. It's not that bad for this build, because I only have to swap one gem, and it's only for a select few encounters, but I'd prefer not to do it at all and generally avoid builds that would require gem swapping. Since I said I started Arch Nemesis League with this build, I should probably say a few words about how to play the character early on in the progression. I'll start by saying that I'm not a great resource for League start strategies. This is for two reasons. First, the best League start guides are written by people who have played one build many times, and I tend not to play the same build more than once. As soon as I know a build works, I have no interest in playing it. Second, I'm not great at starting leagues and leveling in general. I don't know the optimal leveling strategies, and for items, I'm basically just winging it every time. With that being said, I'll share what I did on this character to start off. I think Infernal Blow is a great skill to start the league with, but Leadership's Price is probably not an immediate goal for the amulet slot. It will take some time before these start showing up on the market, and when they do, the good rolls will be expensive. Furthermore, committing to Leadership's Price early restricts your gear progression, because it's annoying to keep your highest two attributes equal while you upgrade gear and allocate passives. I know this because I used Leadership's Price early on and ended up using mediocre gear until my level was in the 90s, since it was too annoying to upgrade stuff while balancing strength and dexterity. If you do decide to use Leadership's Price early on, you can do what I did, which is to buy a badly rolled one with negative rolls on the max resists, then ignore the downside by using a lore weave that sets your maximum resistances to 78%. I didn't actually end up using Arn's Anguish until later in the progression either. Maintaining brutal charges isn't fully reliable until you have Divergent Urgent Orders and the extra charge duration from the Mastery. For my weapon, I used a 6-link Doomsower until I was able to craft a better weapon. It's got pretty good DPS early on, but not having the hits can't be evaded mod from a crafted sword meant I had to use the Precision Aura instead of Grace until I crafted a rare sword. Honestly, the more I talk about this, the more inclined I am to recommend just playing a different variant of Infernal Blow until you can get all the pieces in place for this. Maybe find an SSF-friendly duelist Infernal Blow build and play that until you have enough money to transition into this. In terms of how the build could be improved, I'd say the most impactful thing would be getting higher maximum resistances. The most obvious way to do this would be to get a better rolled Leadership's Price. I might even recommend trying the build with a one-handed sword and a shield instead of a two-handed sword. A shield with life, 60% crit reduction, and 2% max resistance would make this build even more durable. A one-handed sword might do less damage, but with other adjustments to gear and passives, I'm sure the damage would be comparable. One likely very expensive upgrade would be the Impossible Escape jewel being introduced in patch 3.18. Each of these jewels specifies a keystone on the passive tree and allows you to allocate passives in a small radius around that keystone, regardless of connection to your own tree. I imagine the Unwavering Stance variant of this jewel will be highly coveted by many builds due to its proximity to the Prismatic Skin cluster, which can grant an additional 3% to all maximum elemental resistances. This build would be no exception. This build's damage could be higher, but if I wanted to, say, double the DPS, I probably wouldn't be able to without some unwanted concessions on the defensive side. You may have a different tolerance for acceptable defense, though, so you're welcome to make those concessions with your own variant of this build. After all, my videos aren't meant to be step-by-step guides on building characters. I'd rather educate people on mechanics and let them draw inspiration from my ideas than give them templates to follow. In any case, I think that's all there is to say. If you think I've missed anything, let me know in the comments. Good luck to everyone in the Sentinel League.